On today's show, it's a new week and a new month for the Atlanta Hawks, and the action is coming fast and furious. We'll have coverage from the last practice before the travel to Abu Dhabi for the team, as well as the latest insights, mailbag questions, and more. All of that on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1319 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday morning. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. And also, Locked On Hawks, along with all of our other Atlanta podcasts, are now available on Roku and Amazon Fire TV as part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. More great local coverage in the sports world 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Atlanta app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And today's show will be kind of a catch-all of sorts. We're now into October officially. The Hawks are, of course, across the pond in Abu Dhabi right now in advance of their back-to-back games against the Bucks. Across the way at this stage, they play Thursday and Saturday in terms of Eastern time. And I was actually in attendance for the last practice before they went across the pond on Friday. So we'll have some thoughts and insight from that. Some mailbag questions coming up as well. The opening line is out for the opener against the Houston Rockets at home. We have some projection talk later on, and a sort of controversial list. Lots of different things on today's podcast, but thank you for joining us as always on the show and making us your first listen each and every day. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast across platforms. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and of course, YouTube on the video side. And we'll start today's podcast with a little bit of news. So on the last practice day before the Hawks went across the pond on Friday, I was in attendance and following up on some things. Of course, they've had a little bit of illness going through the team in the training camp stages. Dejounte Murray famously missed the open practice with an illness, as did Trent Forrest. And then Jalen Johnson was out with some illness concerns on Friday. It was alerted to us in the media that were there that Jalen Johnson and Trent Forrest both missed that final practice and both had been ill before that. So I asked Nate what has kind of been happening with that. That was Friday, by the way, and I reported at about 5 a.m. this morning, some more detail on that. But in the meantime, here is what Nate had to say about Johnson and Forrest missing the practice and not being able to travel, it seems, to Abu Dhabi. Are there any challenges for the guys not feeling well as you're about to board an international flight like that? A couple guys, they're not.
Yeah, well, they can't travel. They can't travel because they're not allowed to come around the team right now. So it's a 24-hour deal. As soon as they feel better, depending on where we are in the trip, we will make a decision on if they come over and join us.
So again, that was a Friday midday piece of audio/video from Nate McMillan. I reported this morning, in fact, right before this podcast is being recorded, before I even go to work. It's very, very early in the morning on Monday as I'm recording this. I reported about 5 a.m. that I was told that neither Johnson nor Forrest are expected to travel to Abu Dhabi at this point in time. As you heard there from Nate, there's a little bit of uncertainty. They left the door open for those guys to potentially go over, whether it be commercially or however that would have worked out, because they could not travel with the team with the illness that they have. But at this point, it does appear like neither will make it over there. Obviously, not that big of a deal. It's preseason games, but I'm sure that both guys would have liked to have had that experience to be across the pond with their team and be there for a week and a half or so. It's a long time to be away from practice and all that fun stuff. And I know that Hawks fans want to see Jalen Johnson. And the Hawks do have 2 more games, though, in the preseason to evaluate him and the practices and all that fun stuff. But hopefully he has the inside track to back up 4 minutes with regard to the roster at this point in time. And the biggest thing is those guys start to get feeling better at this stage. But after some optimism that they could travel over in the couple days after the Hawks left, there was always going to be sort of a point of no return where they would not travel over there. It seems like that's been the case now on this Monday morning. Elsewhere, in terms of sights and sounds from that practice, Nate McMillan also spoke to us about a couple of different things. Lauren Williams of the AJC asked Nate about how much the rotation decisions early in the season are based on what they see in practice versus games. He gave sort of a pretty generic answer about that, using both, and talks about how he'll listen to the front office when asked about that by Lauren. And McMillan made it clear, though, it was his final choice as to who is playing and when this season. Also, an update on AJ Griffin, who had been out of the open practice, etc. Here's what Nate had to say about AJ.
AJ did go through live play today. He scrimmaged. He was limited in what he could do, but he pretty much went most of the practice. So it was good to see him back out.
From what you saw, how do you think he did? And especially going up against a bit more experience than what he might be used to.
Well, he hasn't had the opportunity to play, so it was really his first time getting out there, and he's anxious to get out there. He missed summer league this year, and then he missed the first part of training camp. So he was excited to just get out there and play with his teammates, and I like what I saw. It was good to see him out there.
Later on, I asked what they're taking into account when considering how much to actually play guys in the preseason, because, of course, there's always sort of a delicate dance there with your best players, a la Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, and more. So here's what Nate had to say about how they'll handle that.
What kind of goes into how much your regulars play in the first couple of preseason games? Like, how do you decide?
We only have 4 preseason games, so I want to get these guys minutes. We will see how they feel, far as if they have any types of injuries or tweaks, but I think I need to get all of our guys, minutes out on the floor. Certainly that first unit, getting some minutes in the game, because we only have 4 preseason games.
And then some insight on Dejounte Murray, who, of course, is the big-ticket acquisition for the Hawks at this stage. I'm going to play some audio for you. You're going to hear the voice of Kevin Chouinard of Hawks.com and ATL on 29. And here's what Nate had to say about Dejounte.
What have you seen from Dejounte now that you've had him in camp to this point of camp?
I think he's a leader. I think he has a voice, but he leads by example. His presence out on the floor commands respect. I think the guys that he's played with, which is mostly that first unit, they've responded to him being out on the floor. He has been comfortable with, kind of running the team, and I like what I see. He brings a lot of energy. I think he brings a toughness, to the lineup, and he certainly brings the defensive presence to the lineup. So it was good to see him back out there today as well.
Some pretty positive stuff there from Nate, talking about leading by example and his presence on both units, and kind of the response to him. Clearly an infusion of talent beyond all else, but also a guy who's been around the block for a while, played in a good organization with the Spurs. And he did miss the open practice, of course, with the illness, but he's back and seemingly firing on all cylinders at this point in time. Elsewhere in that practice, Onyeka Okongwu spoke to the media, and the audio is pretty rough, so I'm going to kind of just pass along kind of what he said there. He backed up a lot of what Nate said about Dejounte, calling him a leader already, said he'd be a strong locker room presence, and no surprise there for a vocal guy like Dejounte. He talks about working on his jump shot a little bit, first with mid-rangers, of course, and hopefully out to three-point range eventually. He talks about himself being a hard worker, which has certainly been backed up from what I've heard around the team, and how that should certainly play into things. Kevin also asked Okongwu about playing with Jalen Johnson. He talked about the advantages of having the two of them together with that real burst, athleticism, and versatility playing together. He talked about sort of being young and able to counteract other front courts that might be bigger than them, but also the fact that they are sort of coordinated and able to kind of be versatile and fly around the court. So I know I'm looking forward to see that pairing together. Jalen, I'm not sure about defensively just yet in terms of awareness, but clearly has a lot of talent and a lot of burst. And Okongwu has really, really impressed everybody when it comes to both his burst athleticism, but also the way he feels the game defensively, which is also always been something that I've been really high about with regard to Okongwu and his defensive profile. So just some sights and sounds there from the last practice. Obviously, there are no media from Atlanta on the trip to Abu Dhabi. It's all team-run stuff. There is some social media stuff happening from the Hawks. I know that on Instagram and Twitter, et cetera. You can sort of follow their journey there, but no impartial media on that trip. So we're kind of flying blind until the games actually happen on Thursday and Saturday, but we'll sort of check in with anything else. And I was told again that Johnson and Forrest are not going to go over there. So that was sort of the big highlight of the last couple of days when it comes to news. All right, we'll have more coming on the show, including opening lines and some mailbag questions, et cetera. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. And these days, every new hire potentially could feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have the access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. I've had to hire a few times for a couple things in the last couple of years, and LinkedIn has proved to be an awesome resource. It's incredibly easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn Jobs, and they have high quality candidates that you need to locate and really to find the best people that are possible to make that hire. Then once you're set up, add the job and the purple hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're actually hiring. LinkedIn Jobs has simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates that have the right skills and experience to help you quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and then eventually hire. You want to finish the year strong, and finding the right team member is a key piece of doing just that. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires against leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to, and they help you do it faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That is linkedin.com/lockedonnba. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Okay, and our friends at BetOnline released some game odds this week. Obviously, it's a little bit early. The Hawks don't play for 2.5 weeks as I record this podcast, but the openers are now out, and the Hawks are currently 9.5-point favorites against the Houston Rockets at home. If you're not a big gambler, it's a pretty big number for a season opening game, especially for a team that does not have major injuries at this stage. The Hawks, of course, have some uncertainty with Bogdanovich, but the Rockets don't have any major injuries, and the Hawks are still almost 10-point favorites in that game at home. Houston's not going to be great this year by any means, but it is the second largest line of any opener in the NBA, according to BetOnline, with only the Minnesota Timberwolves being a bigger favorite against the Oklahoma City Thunder at home. And that one is very obviously aided by injury. There's some uncertainty with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, their best player, OKC, and also Chet Holmgren is out for the season for the Thunder. So that is kind of what playing in there. So one of the easier openers on paper in the NBA. Nothing is assured always, especially that early in the season. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the Hawks should be in a pretty solid position to get an opening night win, potentially at home. Not much else to kind of take away from that other than Houston is not going to be great this year, but the Hawks are the better team. They're playing at home, and a lot can change. The Hawks will play 4 times between now and then. We'll probably get more information on Bogdanovich. More sort of injuries can happen, illnesses can happen, etc. But right now, that is looking like a fairly comfortable opener when it comes to all things considered at this stage. Elsewhere, Kevin Pelton of ESPN, who's been on this podcast before, shouts to Kevin Pelton, very smart guy in terms of the numbers and the analysis of the NBA. He talked about his projections, and on a recent podcast in late September, I talked about a few of those things. He teased some numbers. We talked about it then. But ESPN finally published its advanced projections of Pelton's numbers at the end of last week, and they are pretty interesting in terms of the win totals and projections for the teams across the NBA. I have heard KP say this before, so I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere, but he's pointed to this in terms of the inconsistency the last few years with the COVID seasons. Last year, sort of that dip in the middle of the year where like half the teams in the league were ravaged by COVID. Also, the shortened seasons. All of the modeling is kind of a little bit out of whack compared to previous years. A lot less data that's reliable at this stage. And Pelton's formula is a combination of his player projections and also the 3-year luck-adjusted RAPM metric. So he even said, basically kind of couching this a little bit, it's not like there's the same confidence level now there used to be a couple of years ago about this, because of also a big thing beyond that is like guys are playing less in terms of the stars in the league. There's more uncertainty with guys missing time with COVID absences and injuries and just rest days. So all that said, the big thing to keep in mind beyond that is that models like this really tend to bring teams to the middle in terms of actual win projections. For example, the number 1 team in Pelton's Western Conference projections is 49 wins. Now, there's almost no way that's going to happen. I think he knows that. I'm sure he knows that, actually. But for projection's sake, if you do, it's kind of like the same thing that happens in baseball. I know for a long time, PECOTA, the baseball prospectus system, always kind of brought teams to the middle. There were not always projected teams that are going to win 98 to 100 games, even though almost every year somebody will actually do that. And only one team in Pelton's projections, which is the Celtics, by the way, has more than 50 wins. And even that is not taking into account anything with the head coaching change there in Boston with the Udoka suspension. So the gap between 2 and 8 in the East in Pelton's projections is 7 total wins between number 2 and number 8. That's a very small gap. The gap between number 1 and number 8 in the West is 7 wins. Now, that's probably not going to happen. But alas, everyone knows that. They're bringing things to the middle. So everything's bunched up. Keep that in mind. But anyway, I'm burying the lead here. The Hawks are number 5 in the Eastern Conference in these projections, behind the Celtics, the Bucks, the Sixers, and the Raptors, actually, in that order. Pelton wrote earlier that he projected the Hawks for number 2 in the league in offense. That's where they were last year, by the way, number 2 in the league. I don't know who's number 1. Last year was Utah. Well, not Utah this year because they've sort of torn things down. But number 2 in the league in offense. And then Pelton has the Hawks jumping to number 19 in defense, which is not fantastic, but that would be notably better than they were last year, with the addition of Dejounte Murray and Justin Holiday and the absence of Gallinari and another year from Okongwu, etc. The defensive talent is definitely better for the Hawks this year than it has been in the past, but all of the questions kind of revolve around how much better. Can they be league average? Can they be top 20? Can they be top 12? Those will kind of all dictate how good they can be this year, because if they're 26th again in defense, there's a pretty hard ceiling on how good a team can be when they're that bad defensively. But if they're 19th, they can be a 50-win team. That's possible with the way things are on their offensive side of the floor with Trae Young keying everything there. So he does have the Hawks less than a win ahead of the Heat and the Nets. So not a huge gap there between like 5 and 7 in the East. But it's definitely one of the higher placements that I've seen about a prominent outlet with the Hawks. Most conversations, I don't want to say all, most conversations nationally with people at prominent outlets have the Hawks kind of in that, late sort of competitive toward missing the play-in, but somewhere in that 6 to 8 range is where I've generally seen the Hawks most places. Like everyone acknowledges, I think for the most part, that the Hawks have a good chance of not being in the play-in, but also the simple math is there are 7, 8, maybe even 9, depending how you feel about the Bulls teams that are competing for 6 spots. And generally speaking, I'm pretty confident that a good team this year is going to be in the play-in. Maybe even 2 good teams are going to be in the play-in this year. Now, the Hawks won the play-in last year. They are better on paper than they were last year, and last year did not go well. But anyway, you can be a good team in the East. You could win 47 games, I would say. It's probably maybe the cap on that. It'd still be in the play-in, but there's definitely going to be a good team or 2 in the play-in this year. But Pelton is pretty high on the Hawks compared to a lot of the projections out there in terms of the placement. And listen, if the Hawks can be a top 20 defense, you got to like what the team's going to look like. Even if they step back to 5 or 6 on offense, that combination of a top 5 offense and a top 20 defense is a good basketball team. And it's just a reminder, again, of how difficult it is to win when you have a bottom 5 defense like the Hawks did last year. So that's part of the calculus there, but they're going to have to perform at a high level. And I think that there's pretty good optimism when it comes to how things are going at this stage. All right, first mailbag question on today's show. I've been holding for a while. It's time to unload it at this stage, and it comes from Bobby. So it's actually a quote tweet that was added in my direction a couple of weeks ago, and it was essentially framing this poll done by Mike Scott of Hoops Hype. And the question is basically, can you believe this? And tell me I'm not crazy to think this list does not make a lot of sense. So I'll take you behind the curtain here. Mike Scotto of Hoops Hype published this poll about 2 weeks ago, maybe even longer than that. And Mike is very good. It's not his fault. He did not produce the results. He just asked the questions. The conceit is that Hoops Hype polled 15 people they describe as NBA executives and asked them to rank their top 5 players under 25 to build around, notably to build around in the future. Hawks fans were very mad about this. And by the way, so was I. I'm not someone that's going to rant and rave. If you're a new listener for this season, I'm not a huge homer. I'm going to tell you what I think objectively. I try to cover the team in an objective fashion, like not super fanboy kind of thing. But I thought this is a pretty ridiculous ranking of Trae Young. So no huge surprises at the top. It was Luka Doncic, it was Jason Tatum, and John Morant in the top 3. I know, there are arguments on all sides there. I would still have Trae over Ja, and I say that all the time on this podcast. It does not know. I will say that it's definitely not crazy to have Ja ahead of Trae. That's fine. You can argue about that if you want to. That's not the focus of this outrage, in my opinion. The list from there gets pretty dicey. So after that top 3, it is in this order: Evan Mobley at 4, Anthony Edwards at 5, Zion Williamson at 6, Scotty Barnes at 7, LaMelo Ball at 8, and then Trae finally at number 9 overall in a tie with Darius Garland, and then Cade Cunningham after that. So there are lots of issues here. I could do a long podcast on this, but I will just do this kind of quickly. So I'm very high on Evan Mobley, and this is still probably too high for me about Evan Mobley after one season. He's going to be really good. I like Evan Mobley a lot. This is pretty aggressive. Not in a way, at least this is a future-facing list. I've kind of said a couple times now on the podcast that Mobley's present-day rankings and some of the top hundreds are pretty crazy in my mind. At least in the future, you could say, like, building around him, if you believe that he's going to be, mini Tim Duncan, this is not crazy. That's definitely too high for me, but I do like Evan Mobley a lot. I can at least understand the arguments for guys like Anthony Edwards and Zion for different reasons. Ant, I was probably too low on coming out of the draft. In fact, I was definitely too low on him coming out of the draft. But he's that big wing that everybody wants. And Zion, of course, was like unbelievably good 2 years ago when he was playing, and he's still seen as a generational talent. I would have Trae ahead of both Ant and Zion and Mobley, to be clear. This is not completely insane. I don't think that Ant and Zion are like indefensibly ahead of Trae. I think Mobley ahead of Trae is pretty bad at this stage, but where it gets completely off the rails is the next two guys. So I am definitely lower on Scotty Barnes than some. I will own that. I cannot imagine having Scotty Barnes ahead of Trae Young on this list. That is not based in reality in my mind. I guess the argument would be that Barnes is bigger and a better defender, and he's super young. I understand that. I don't see those guys as comparable prospects. I think that Scotty Barnes will never be as good as Trae Young has already been in my mind. Now, is it possible I'm wrong about that? Sure. But I think that Trae has proven so much more that I don't really understand that ranking. But the single worst one in my mind is LaMelo Ball. Now, I've always liked LaMelo Ball. That's the funny thing about this. I had Melo ahead of Anthony Edwards in that draft class, which is, I think, wrong at this point. I would rather have Ant now. But I've always liked Melo. He's a big-time talent. He was legitimately good last season. At the same time, I don't understand a world in which anyone would have him over Trae right now. Like, yes, he's younger than Trae, but they're the same position. They have similar strengths and weaknesses, and Trae is just better across the board, basically, than LaMelo Ball. Now, LaMelo is bigger, and he's a better rebounder and a better defender kind of by default, because Melo is not a good defender at all. He's better than Trae because he's just bigger, but he's pretty bad defensively, and only because of Trae's weaknesses is he better there. On offense, it's not even close, honestly. And LaMelo is really good on offense, but there's not really anything I can think of other than rebounding that Melo does better than Trae. Like, Trae's a better shooter. Trae's a better passer. He's more established. The numbers are what they are. Like, I don't really understand. That head-to-head, like, at least with the cross-positional stuff, if you are just the biggest Scotty Barnes stan in the world, you could say, look, that position, that archetype is more valuable. I wouldn't agree with you, but at least, like, you can kind of make an argument. Point guard versus point guard, I don't really understand LaMelo over Trae. That's a baffling choice by multiple people. I mean, you don't end up with a guy like that. This is a list that's not made by one person. This is a rank. This is a poll combined. So that's kind of weird. Similar with Darius Garland, by the way, who Trae is actually tied with on this list. Darius Garland's really good. I don't understand an argument for Darius Garland over Trae Young. That doesn't make any sense to me, because Garland's a bad defender too, and Trae is pretty obviously better on offense. So what are we doing here? Anyway. And also, before I move on quickly, this is not a Hawks thing, but I think Cade Cunningham is too low on this list. He should be behind Trae, but he's a better prospect than Barnes for me, and Ball for me, and maybe a couple other guys as well. Anyway, another story there, but that's I understand the outrage. A lot of these lists are like kind of concocted to produce outrage. We'll talk about top 100 lists at some point in the next couple of weeks. I'm trying to save that for later on. But those are definitely built for outrage, and I will give you my thoughts on kind of where a couple guys were on the Hawks on those lists. But yeah, this is one I've been holstering for a while, but I thought that was a very ridiculous ranking for Trae Young. You can be low on Trae. I do understand the weaknesses. Trust me. I've talked about him every day of his career, basically. But there's no argument where he's not a top 4 or 5 guy in terms of building around for the top 25, much less number 9 and behind guys like LaMelo Ball and Scotty Barnes. That's ludicrous. Okay. One more break now to hear from our sponsors on today's podcast. We'll have more in a moment, but first, that break. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. Football is, of course, here in a big way in October, and BetOnline is the number one source for all the pro and college football news you might be having this year across the board. That includes the latest developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts at BetOnline, and they have all the content that you need for the weekend slate in pro and college football. BetOnline is also a continued source for wagering information. That includes live betting and esports and live scores. BetOnline is the fastest and the easiest way to consume every sport you have interest in at this point in time. And on this show, we talk about the NBA. There are plenty of future odds out there between season win totals and conference odds, division odds, title odds, individual award odds, now game odds as well, and much more beyond the NBA. BetOnline has odds and lines on college sports and MMA, and baseball, boxing, golf, tennis, auto racing, horse racing, soccer, entertainment bets, and much more. Head to BetOnline right now on your computer or mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, and a question from Zach Goodman, who says, if this is the year Onyeka Okongwu pops, what happens with Capella? You mentioned that the Hawks did not draft O to be a backup. If he shows he can be a starter, what is the optimal situation for Capella? What is the most likely situation for Capella? And he's got 3 more years on a contract. Is it movable? Will the front office trade him for depth elsewhere? And if so, what positions? Would Clint be willing to transition to being a backup? Is he that kind of guy? And lots of questions in here, obviously. This is definitely the age-old question when it comes to Onyeka and Capella. But for new listeners, and I probably refresh this a little bit, it's a great problem, quote-unquote, to have 2 really, really good centers. I still believe Capella is a top 10 center in the league. He's that good. He looks good this year so far. Defensively, he's extremely valuable. I know that some Hawks fans don't love Capella. I think that's probably a lot of it is because of Okongwu. And listen, he's not the greatest offensive player in the world. I do understand that, but he's got a lot of value there because with his screening and his rebounding, etc. But no matter what, it's a great problem to have both these guys. I've said it before, but the Hawks don't have a player like Jokic or Embiid. I do understand that. But basically no team in the league has a backup like Okongwu. And with Capella already being really good, you could argue that like 48 minutes of center for the Hawks, they are in a sort of in the elite category there. Because yes, you'd rather have Jokic and anybody versus Capella and Okongwu, but there are still 8 to 12 minutes a game where Jokic is going to be on the bench, and the Hawks have a huge advantage there with Okongwu versus whoever the backup is for the Sixers or the Nuggets. Anyway, to the questions. I have said several times, by the way, that Hawks did not plan to draft Okongwu and have him still be a backup in year 3. Now, there are 2 reasons for that, basically, as to why he's still in that role now. One of those reasons is that Okongwu has had the injuries, and he's played less than 100 games in his career across 2 seasons in the regular season. So the other one, and the bigger one in real life probably, is that Capella has been so valuable to the Hawks that they have not been able to move off from him with any sort of decide to move on from him. So again, I know there's a contingent of Hawks fans that don't really buy it with Capella and want to see Okongwu. I don't blame you. Okongwu is awesome. But Capella is, again, maybe the best rebounder in the league, one of the best 5 for sure. He's an excellent defender. He can command the defense. He's a very valuable screen setter and pick and roll partner for Trae Young. Trae really values that, has said as much behind the scenes and in front of the mic, and that's been reported on quite a bit. So at least for now, the Hawks are at their best when they have both of these guys on the roster, and Capella is still the better player and the more proven guy now. Like, would it stun me if Okongwu this season was better than Capella? No, it wouldn't. But to this point, there's this narrative out there, I think in some corners, that Okongwu is already better. That's not the case. Capella's a better player right now today than Okongwu. Now, Okongwu, upside-wise, sky high. I love Okongwu. But anyway, having both those guys is really helpful. I do think that Okongwu has a huge chance to prove himself even more this year. Eventually, I do believe the Hawks are going to move on from Capella, if I had to guess. My broad view is that one of them probably won't be here next year, and it's more likely that it's still Okongwu being in Atlanta and Capella not. As far as the contract is concerned, there are 3 years left for Capella, including this year, at a decent clip, but honestly a bargain when you look around the league and see where the money is going. So he's making between about 18.5 and 23, roughly, the next 3 years per season. It's a lot of money, but it's really not a lot of money with where the cap is actually going for the NBA. That's a whole different podcast, but like, look around the league at what guys are getting that are not as good as Capella. Tyler Hero has never been as good as Capella in his career at any point, and he got $30+ million a season. So Capella, you could say that was kind of a risky extension on some level because he's getting older and all that stuff. But at that money, that's like barely starter money in the current and sort of future-facing landscape in the league. So that's a very, very movable contract. So basically, to answer that question, like, yes, it's movable in trade very, very easily. As long as Capella is healthy and playing at a decent level, even last year's level or even below that, he's still a positive value contract on that deal. So yeah, very easily movable to answer that question. I don't think, like, barring a huge downturn, that the Hawks would keep Capella as a backup to Okongwu because he's making that much money. He has real value as a trade piece. So if they're deciding that it's going to be Okongwu's team at some point in the next 12 months, I think that means trading Capella rather than benching Capella, if that makes sense. Because there's no reason not to do that. I think you probably see that in terms of like stocking the cupboard elsewhere. The Hawks are going to need some wing help in the future. And obviously that's something that maybe could prioritize in a deal for Capella. And I think it might have happened already if Capella wasn't already so valuable and Okongwu had been a little bit healthier in his first 2 seasons. So a lot is riding on how Okongwu plays this year. That's kind of the main thing about it. And while I think there is kind of a ceiling on how much he's going to play, as long as Capella is healthy, there'll be games, I would imagine, where Capella is unavailable for rest or injury or whatever. And you'll see 35 minutes of Okongwu, and I'm sure people will be excited about that. I will be too. But I think that night by night, maybe low 20s in terms of minutes for Okongwu. That's not a ton. And I think that maybe as he spaces out a little bit to the with his jump shot, as we talked about earlier in the podcast a little bit when he talked to the media on Friday, I hesitate to assign him plus shooting now. I do believe that he'll become a shooter in the future. I know he made the 1-3 at open practice, etc. He's got to prove it a little bit. And there are lineups where he can play some at the 4 this year. Like, for instance, if they don't love what they're seeing from Jalen Johnson, maybe you kind of prioritize some lineups every game with Okongwu at the 4, quote unquote, next to Frank Kaminsky, who's more of a floor spacer. That does make some sense. Have Okongwu play defense at the 4 and have Kaminsky kind of be the pick and pop guy. I don't think Okongwu and Capella work a ton together. In fact, probably not at all. But defensively, it'd be awesome. Offensively, it'd be tough. Maybe you want to play those guys with Trae, Murray, and Bogey and kind of go super heavy offense on the perimeter and then throw in those guys on the back line defensively. That would be interesting in some level. So we'll see if that actually comes together. But no matter what, Okongwu, by the way, will be restricted as a free agent in 2 years. So the Hawks are going to have to make a decision on him. In fact, he's extension eligible at the end of this coming season. So it's a big year for information on Okongwu. It's a big year for him to stay healthy, hopefully, knock on wood. He seems to be in great shape. He seems to be ready to go and focused. I think the Hawks are going to have a huge advantage over most teams at center this year, 48 minutes, and I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, I'm super high on Okongwu, and I do think that in terms of like the transition will probably happen at some point. The Hawks do believe, I'm sure, that long-term Okongwu will be their guy at center. It's just that Capella's kind of just made himself indispensable, and Okongwu has not been on the floor just quite enough to drive that away at this stage. So hopefully that answers all the questions. We'll have more in the future, obviously, on that topic. All right, that's going to be it for today's podcast. We'll have much more in the future, including game breakdowns. If you are new to the podcast, what I do after pretty much every game, if not every game, whatever I possibly can, but usually every game, I will do a recap podcast, whether it's on the weekend or during the week. If I'm traveling or something like that, I might combine 2 games into one. But for the most part, I will have full game coverage of every game. I watch every game multiple times. That's part of my spiel here on the podcast. That'll be happening on Thursday. We'll have at least one show between now and then as well. But the Hawks do open Thursday at noon Eastern. And that is a NBA TV game if you want to watch that game online or on TV or wherever. So we'll have more on that in the future as well. But please subscribe to the podcast. Please tell your friend about the show. The season is now nearing in a big way. The Hawks are playing an opener in 16 days as I record this podcast early in the morning on Monday, October 3rd. So spread the word. Help us with that. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. We'll see you next time.